Story 1. It was the fall of 2018, and I had just moved to a small town in Pennsylvania called Mechanicsburg. I was 24 years old, fresh out of college, and ready to start my first job. The town was quaint, with tree-lined streets, friendly neighbors, and a sense of peace that I had been craving after years of living in the busy city of Philadelphia. I found a small, two-story house to rent on a quiet street called Oakwood Avenue. The house was old, but it had character. Wooden floors, a wraparound porch, and a backyard with a tall, ancient oak tree. It was the perfect place to start my new life. Or so I thought. From the moment I moved in, I noticed that something was off about the house. The first night I spent there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The house creaked and groaned as the wind blew through the old wooden beams, and the sound of leaves rustling outside only added to the eerie atmosphere. I tried to tell myself it was just the natural noises of an old house, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger as the days went by. A week after moving in, I met my neighbor, Mrs. Green. She was an elderly woman who had lived on Oakwood Avenue for over 50 years. She had a kind smile and a gentle demeanor, and I was relieved to finally meet someone in the neighborhood. We chatted for a bit, and she told me stories about the town and its history. But when I mentioned the house I was living in, her expression changed. She looked uncomfortable, almost as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. After a moment of awkward silence, she simply told me to be careful and that the house had a history. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what Mrs. Green had said. What did she mean by a history? I decided to do some research, so I spent the next few evenings at the local library, digging through old records and newspaper archives. What I found sent a chill down my spine. The house I was living in had been vacant for nearly a decade before I moved in. Previous owners, a couple named the Wilsons, had mysteriously disappeared in 2008. There were no signs of forced entry or foul play, but their belongings were left behind, as if they had just vanished into thin air. The case had never been solved, and the house had gained a reputation as being haunted. I tried to push the unsettling information out of my mind, but the strange occurrences in the house only intensified. I would hear footsteps in the hallway at night, even though I was the only one in the house. Doors would creak open on their own, and I would often feel a cold breeze brush past me, even when all the windows were closed. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, reading a book, when I heard a loud thud upstairs. It sounded like something heavy had fallen to the floor. My heart raced as I cautiously made my way up the creaky staircase. I slowly pushed open the door to the bedroom, and my breath caught in my throat. The room was empty, but there was a large, dusty box in the center of the floor. I hadn't been there before. I hesitated for a moment before opening the box. Inside, I found old photographs, letters, and personal belongings that had once belonged to the Wilsons. As I sifted through the items, I came across a faded photograph of the couple standing in front of the house, their faces frozen in an expression of terror. At that moment, I heard a whisper so faint that I almost didn't catch it. "Get out, Dad." My heart pounded in my chest as I turned around, but no one was there. I grabbed the photograph and ran downstairs, leaving the box and its contents behind. The next morning, I decided to visit Mrs. Green again, hoping she could shed some light on what was happening. When I arrived at her house, she invited me in with a concerned look on her face. I showed her the photograph, and she gasped. She explained that the Wilsons had been good friends of hers and that they had been deeply troubled in the months leading up to their disappearance. They had claimed to hear voices in the house, see shadowy figures at night, and feel an overwhelming sense of dread. Mrs. Green warned me to leave the house as soon as possible, but I was hesitant. I had just moved in, and the thought of packing up and leaving so soon felt like admitting defeat. But that night, the house made the decision for me. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard the whispering again. It started as a faint murmur, but it quickly grew louder, until it was a chorus of voices echoing through the walls. "Get out," they chanted over and over. My body was paralyzed with fear, but I knew I had to leave. I grabbed my keys, ran out of the house, and drove to the nearest motel. The next day, I called a moving company and arranged to have my belongings packed up and moved out. I never went back to that house, and I never looked back. To this day, I don't know what happened to the Wilsons or what was haunting that house, but I do know one thing: some places are better left alone. Story 2. This incident took place around 5 years ago, in the summer of 2010. I had just arrived in Braintree, Massachusetts, to stay with my grandparents, as I did every year. My grandparents lived in a quiet suburb just outside of Boston, in a cozy neighborhood where everyone seemed to know each other. The house was warm and familiar, filled with the scent of my grandmother's cooking and the faint sound of the TV in the background. By the time I got to their house and into bed, it was already past 1:30 a.m. I was only 10 years old at the time, and the idea of being awake so late made me feel incredibly grown up. I wanted to stay up all night, imagining myself as part of some grand adventure, but the exhaustion from the long flight finally caught up with me, and I dozed off around 3 a.m. The next morning, I was groggy and reluctant to leave the comfort of my bed, but my grandmother, ever the planner, already mapped out a full day of shopping, summer camp clothes. She had a reputation for being thorough, ensuring that I had everything I needed for the upcoming weeks. Despite my protests, she insisted that we leave early to beat the crowds at the South Shore Plaza, one of the biggest malls in Massachusetts. This mall was a sprawling complex with hundreds of stores, a food court, and even an indoor carousel. It was a favorite spot for locals, especially during the summer when the temperatures soared. We arrived at the mall around mid-morning, the sun shining brightly overhead. The parking lot was already filling up, and my grandmother, always careful, chose a spot close to the entrance. As we walked through the sliding glass doors, the cool blast of air conditioning hit us, a welcome relief from the summer heat. The mall was just beginning to bustle with the morning crowd, families, groups of teenagers, and older couples strolling leisurely from store to store. Our first stop was at Macy's, where my grandmother meticulously combed through racks of clothes, picking out outfits she thought would be perfect for summer camp. She was in her element, chatting with the store clerks, getting their opinions on the latest styles. I, on the other hand, was less enthusiastic. My 14-year-old sister Emily was equally unenthused but more patient than I was, trying on clothes without complaint. After what felt like hours, we finally headed to the food court for lunch. The food court at South Shore Plaza was a large, open space filled with the aroma of various cuisines: pizza, Chinese food, burgers, and more. We settled on a table near the entrance and decided to grab something quick. I remember choosing a slice of pepperoni pizza from Sparrow, one of the many options available, and a Dr. Pepper to go with it. My grandmother opted for a salad, while Emily went for a burger and fries from Johnny Rocket. We ate in relative silence, the noise of the mall a constant hum in the background. As we were finishing up, I noticed a man staring at me from a few tables away. He was middle-aged, probably in his late 40s or early 50s, with thinning brown hair, a scruffy beard. He wore a stained brown shirt that looked like it hadn't been washed in days, and old jeans that were frayed at the edges. Even from a distance, it smelled the stench of cigarettes and Hall clinging to him. His eyes, bloodshot and unnerving, were locked onto me. I felt a shiver run down my spine. At that age, I wasn't fully aware of the dangers that lurked in the world, though I didn't immediately recognize the signs. I was a skinny kid, always underweight for my age, not because I wasn't fed, but because I was never very hungry. I was used to people making comments about how thin I was, though I assumed that was why this man was staring. But there was something different in his gaze, something that made me feel uneasy. After we finished eating, we continued our shopping, this time stopping at H&M, one of Emily's favorite stores. The sign in the window read, "No food or drinks allowed," and since I still had my Dr. Pepper, I decided to wait outside on a bench, while my sister and grandmother went inside. The mall wasn't too crowded that day, so I figured I'd be fine waiting alone for a few minutes. I sat down on the bench, cool leather beneath me, a contrast to the warmth of the sun streaming through the skylight above. I was tired, my eyes heavy with the remnants of sleep from the night before, and I found myself drifting off slightly. That's when I saw him again, the same man from the food court. He turned the corner from one of the side corridors, his eyes immediately finding mine as if he had been looking for me. My heart skipped a beat. I felt a wave of fear wash over me. He walked slowly, deliberately, as if he had all the time in the world. My mind was racing, but my body felt paralyzed. I was too scared to move, too scared to even look away. I kept my eyes on his worn-out sneakers, telling myself that if he took one more step toward me, I would run into the store and find my grandmother. The man finally stopped a few feet away, leaning casually against one of the pillars that lined the corridor. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his eyes never leaving me. I tried to shrink into myself, wishing I could disappear, but I knew that wasn't an option. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. His voice was raspy, like someone who had spent years smoking, and the words he said sent a chill down my spine. "You look lost, little girl. Do you need some help?" The question hung in the air, menacing and heavy. I couldn't respond. My throat felt dry, and my voice seemed to have abandoned me. I just wanted my grandmother and sister to come out of the store and take me away from this man, but they were still inside, oblivious to what was happening just outside. I stared at my drink, focusing on the condensation forming on the cup, trying to block out the man's presence. But I could feel his eyes on me, boring into me, as if he was trying to read my thoughts. The mall, once a place of safety and comfort, now felt like a trap. Just when I thought I couldn't take it any longer, the doors to the store opened, and my grandmother and Emily walked out, chatting happily about the clothes they had found. The man immediately straightened up, a look of frustration crossing his face. He glanced at them, then back at me, before quickly walking away, disappearing into the crowd. I watched him go, my heart pounding in my chest, relieved but still shaken. As soon as they reached me, I blurted out what had happened, the words tumbling over each other in my haste to get them out. My grandmother's face went pale, and she pulled me close, wrapping her arms around me in a protective hug. Emily looked worried too, carefree demeanor gone. My grandmother quickly decided that we should leave the mall, and we made our way to the exit, her arm firmly around my shoulders. As we walked back to the car, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man following us, but he was nowhere to be seen. Drive back to my grandparents' house was quiet, the usual conversation replaced by a tense silence. When we got home, my grandmother sat me down and told me that I had done the right thing by staying where I was and not talking to strangers. She assured me that we were safe now, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. That night, as I lay in bed, the events of the day replayed in my mind. I kept seeing the man's eyes, the way they had locked onto mine, and I wondered what would have happened if my grandmother and sister hadn't come out when they did. The thought terrified me, and I pulled the covers up to my chin, trying to push it out of my mind. For years after that, I was haunted by the memory of that encounter. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, especially in public places. Even now, whenever I visit a mall, I can't help but feel a twinge of fear, a reminder of that day in Braintree, Massachusetts, when a seemingly ordinary trip to the mall almost turned into something far more sinister. Story 4. It was the summer of 2012, and I was 17 years old, excitedly counting down the days until our family trip to Lake Tahoe, California. My family and I had been planning this trip for months, eagerly anticipating a week of hiking, swimming, and exploring the beautiful scenery that surrounded the lake. Nestled in the Sierra Nevada mountains, Lake Tahoe was a popular vacation destination known for its crystal-clear waters, lush forests, and breathtaking views. We had rented a cabin near the North Shore, away from the more crowded tourist spots, hoping for a peaceful and relaxing getaway. We left our home in San Francisco early in the morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon as we packed up the car. My parents, David and Linda, were in high spirits, chatting excitedly about the plans for the week. My younger brother, Jake, who was 15, was less enthusiastic, already complaining about the long drive ahead. Despite his grumbling, I could tell he was looking forward to the trip as much as the rest of us. The drive to Lake Tahoe took about 4 hours, winding through the scenic mountain roads. We made a few stops along the way, including one at a small diner in Auburn, California, where we grabbed breakfast. The diner was a quaint, old-fashioned place with red leather booths and checkered floors, the kind where the waitresses called you hun, and the coffee was always fresh. We ordered pancakes, eggs, and bacon, the smell of which filled the car as we continued our journey. By the time we reached the cabin, it was early afternoon, and the sun was high in the sky. The cabin was everything we had hoped for: cozy, rustic, and surrounded by towering pine trees. It had a large deck that overlooked the forest, and you could hear the distant sound of the lake lapping against the shore. As soon as we arrived, my parents began unpacking while Jake and I explored the area. The forest was dense and quiet, the air cool and crisp, a refreshing change from the city. That first day was spent settling in and getting acquainted with our surroundings. We took a short walk down to the lake, marveling at the clear, blue water that stretched out before us. There were a few other families nearby. For the most part, the area was quiet and peaceful. That evening, we had a barbecue on the deck, enjoying the warm summer breeze and the smell of grilling meat. After dinner, we sat around the fire pit, roasting marshmallows and telling stories until the stars came out, twinkling brightly in the clear night sky. The next morning, my dad suggested we go for a hike along one of the many trails that wound through the forest. He had found a map of the area in the cabin and was eager to explore. My mom packed a picnic lunch, and we set off mid-morning, the sun already warming the cool mountain air. The trail we chose was about 5 miles long and led to a small waterfall, perfect spot for our picnic. The hike started off easy enough, the trail well-marked and the scenery breathtaking. We walked in single file, my dad leading the way, followed by Jake, my mom, and then me at the back. I was enjoying the tranquility of the forest, the sound of birds chirping, and the rustle of leaves underfoot. The trail was surrounded by towering pines, their needles carpeting the ground in a soft, fragrant layer. Every now and then we would catch a glimpse of the lake through the trees, its surface sparkling in the sunlight. About halfway through the hike, we came across a small clearing where we decided to take a break. There was a fallen log that made for a perfect seat, and we sat down, sipping water and catching our breath. The clearing was bathed in sunlight, and wildflowers dotted the ground, adding splashes of color to the green landscape. It was peaceful, the only sounds being the distant trickle of the waterfall and the chirping of crickets. As we sat there, I noticed a figure moving through the trees on the far side of the clearing. At first, I thought it was just another hiker, but something about the way they moved caught my attention. The figure was tall and lanky, dressed in dark clothing, seemed out of place in the bright summer day. They were walking slowly, almost deliberately, as if they were trying not to be seen. I nudged my dad, pointing in the direction of the figure, but by the time he looked, they had disappeared into the trees. Probably just another hiker, my dad said dismissively, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We continued our hike, but I couldn't stop thinking about the figure in the woods. As we got closer to the waterfall, the trail became narrower and more rugged, the trees closing in around us. The sound of the waterfall grew louder, a constant roar that filled the air. When we finally reached the waterfall, it was even more beautiful than I had imagined. The water cascaded down a series of rocks, creating a mist that hung in the air, cooling us as we approached. We found a spot on a large flat rock near the base of the waterfall to have our picnic. My mom laid out a blanket, and we unpacked the lunch she had prepared: sandwiches, chips, and fresh fruit. As we ate, the sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. But even as I enjoyed the moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement, saw nothing. My parents and Jake didn't seem to notice anything unusual, laughing and chatting as if everything was perfectly normal. I tried to relax, telling myself that I was just being paranoid, but the uneasy feeling lingered. After lunch, we decided to explore the area around the waterfall. Jake and I climbed up the rocks to get a better view of the waterfall from above, while my parents stayed below, taking pictures. The view from the top was incredible, the water rushing down in a powerful torrent, the sound almost deafening. But as I stood there, looking out over the forest, I spotted something that made my heart skip a beat. Far off in the distance, near the edge of the forest, I saw the same figure I had seen earlier. They were standing still, partially hidden behind a tree, but I could see them clearly enough to know it was the same person. They were watching us, their face obscured by the shadows of the trees. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I quickly climbed back down to where my parents were. "Dad, I saw that person again," I said, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "Where?" he asked, his expression turning serious. "Over there, by the edge of the forest." I pointed in the direction where I had seen the figure. By the time my dad looked, they were gone again. "Let's pack up and head back," Dad said, his tone now more urgent. My mom looked concerned, but didn't question him, quickly gathering up our things. We started back down the trail, this time moving at a faster pace, my dad constantly looking over his shoulder. The uneasiness I had felt earlier had now settled into a full-blown sense of dread. As we hurried down the trail, the forest seemed to close in around us, trees casting long shadows in the afternoon light. The once peaceful silence now felt oppressive, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sending my heart racing. I kept looking back, half expecting to see the figure following us. The trail behind us remained empty. We finally reached the clearing where we had taken our break earlier, and that's when things took a terrifying turn. As we entered the clearing, we saw the figure standing there in the middle, as if waiting for us. They were closer now, and I could see that it was a man, his face partially hidden by a hood. He was tall and thin, his clothes tattered and dirty, and there was something menacing about the way he stood there, completely still. My dad stepped in front of us, trying to shield us from the man. "What do you want?" he called out, trying to sound calm, but I could hear the edge of fear in his voice. The man didn't respond, just stood there staring at us. The tension in the air was palpable, and I felt my mom's hand tighten around mine. After what felt like an eternity, the man finally took a step forward, and that's when my dad grabbed us and started running. We bolted back down the trail, not daring to look back. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. My dad quickly unlocked the doors, and we scrambled inside, locking the doors behind us. We sat there for a moment, catching our breath, my dad scanning the area for any sign of a man. But there was no one in sight. The forest around us was quiet, almost eerily so, as if nothing had happened. My dad started the car, and we sped away from the cabin, not looking back. The drive back to San Francisco was tense, the usual chatter replaced by a heavy silence. When we finally got home, my dad called the local authorities to report what had happened, but they didn't find anything. No one else in the area had seen the man, and there were no signs of anyone living in the forest near our cabin. To this day, I still don't know who that man was or what he wanted. But every time I think about that summer trip to Lake Tahoe, I can't help but feel a sense of unease, wondering if he's still out there, lurking in the woods, waiting for the next unsuspecting family to cross his path.